Welcome to Beholder Beauty Podcast. And my guest today is Mikala Albertson, who is a board-certified family practice doctor, author, and well-being advocate. And she's passionate about women and our bodies. And she has two books. One is Ordinary on Purpose, and the other is her new book, Everything I Wish I Could Tell You About Midlife, a Woman's Guide to Health in the Body You Actually Have. That's a really good point, the body we actually have. I love that. So first, we're going to start off by introducing you to our listeners and telling us about yourself.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today and chat with all of you. I am Mikala, as you said, and I'm a board-certified family practice doctor. I got to do a year-long fellowship in women's health at the end of my training. So I've always been really passionate about seeing women and hearing their stories and holding a little space and helping them wherever I can. I was out in clinical practice for 18 years. And then about 2 years ago, I actually quit that job and I'm writing full time. And so when I quit, that's when I started on this new book, Everything I Wish I Could Tell You About Midlife. And I find myself as a midlife woman now at 45 and teenagers and learning to parent the kid who had left my home while still kind of taking care of my littles. And I've got all the hormones to go along with it. And so that's why I decided I needed to put everything I could down in a book.
That is, I had mentioned in an email I sent you that was really wonderful for me to read because I'm 65. So I don't know if that's out of the middle or on the other side of the middle or the end of the middle but looking back over it, when I was in the middle, there was the Suzanne Summers book. It was really the only one I had, Beauty After 40. But your book, reading it, I was like, oh, book is really what I needed at that time, because I found myself just experimenting with so many things when you all of a sudden start feeling that point where you start feeling you are going crazy and and it's the hormones, but at first you don't realize it, but you know something's really off. You're just like, what is going on with everything in my life? And so it's just, I think this book, I was telling some of my friends who are in their 30s, saying, this is something we probably really need to read because this is going to happen soon and you can be prepared for it. And so I think that's a big part of it, is just having the knowledge and being prepared for it.
Sure. Putting some words to what's going on. I've had the privilege of being with so many different women in all different life stages, and when I was young in practice, I started out in clinical practice at 28. I couldn't relate, but I was listening and sort of taking in all these stories, and they were so similar. And then when I entered my mid 40s, I'm like, oh, this is what they're talking about. It's that feeling of something is wrong. I just don't feel right. And I don't feel like myself. And I don't know what it is. I feel tired. I get a little bit crazy. And I know we're not supposed to use that word crazy, but like you feel just not yourself. And I just knew that was something then I needed to write about, both from the perspective of patients that I've seen, but also now from my own perspective, beginning to experience some of those symptoms myself.
In your book, which I encourage all of the listeners to pick up, it's a really beautiful book. It tells us about our bodies, but it's more than that. It's how to live life book, I think, from your own experience with your life. And you're so honest and vulnerable in your book. I mean, it's heart-wrenching at times, but get glorious at times. And so the one story that sets off the book about the heart, I would love you to tell us that story.
Yeah, well, writing down this story just sort of came to me before I started this book. I had to sort of write down this story. And so I remember I was out for a walk then with a couple of my neighbors and telling them, I wrote this story down about what happened to me, and I'm not sure really what to do with it. And then as I started the book, I thought, oh, this is where this goes. This is why I wrote this. So it's funny how the writing process comes to you in little pieces, right? But this story is about one time in residency when I was doing my cardiothoracic surgery rotation. And I, as a family practice resident, often during surgery would just kind of observe, or I might close the skin at the end of a surgery, or often we were retractors. We would hold the retractors to sort of hold things out of the way so that the surgeon could do their work. But this day, the surgeon, and sometimes we didn't even get to scrub in. We would just watch from a distance. But this day, the surgeon wanted me to scrub in. And so I tell the story of how the surgical nurse said, hey, he must like you because he often doesn't let anyone scrub in. And so kind of like you're lucky to be up there. And so I was right there in the middle of it, and we, cracked the chest, and that was a real experience to see. And then you get to see someone's heart. And it's interesting because the heart is still. They use this kind of elaborate cardiopulmonary bypass machine to sort of bypass the heart so that the heart can be still when they're doing a bypass surgery. And so that was interesting. I had not seen that before. And then he let me hold the heart. You have to hold the heart up and a little to the side so that they can use the veins that they've harvested from the leg to sort of stitch on these really delicate cardiac arteries and use those veins instead to bring oxygen to the heart. So he said, hey, I'm going to have you hold the heart. And he just kind of grabbed my hands and put them around the heart and said, okay, you have to hold it really still and not too tight, because if you hold it too tight, you're going to poke a hole through the heart. It's really delicate. You'll poke through the muscle. And he said, but do not hold it too loose, because if it's, if it slips at all while I'm stitching, it can rip the vessels that we've just harvested and it will kind of ruin the graft. And so I'm like, okay, thinking I can do this. And so I just had to hold it. And I say in the book, like, not too light and not too tight. I just had to hold it perfectly. And then as he reached in and was doing the surgery, I couldn't really see, because I'm just off to the side. And so I had to just sit there and not move and just hold this heart. And it was this amazing experience. I told my husband when I got home, guess what I got to do today? I got to hold someone's heart. He's like, oh, wow. Yeah, that's cool. You probably won't ever get to do that again. And for a long time, I thought, yeah, I probably won't. But in the book, I sort of explained that practicing medicine and really in many of the connections I have with friends or other women, every time I'm listening to their stories or I'm listening to their lives, that's what we do with each other, is we hold one another's hearts, and we have to hold them, firmly, not too light and not too tight, right? To help one another through this experience of life. So I just use that as sort of this metaphor for what the book is. It is, I think, holding your heart and offering you all of mine in the process.
Yes, and I love how God gave you that experience to really be able to see that as a metaphor, but also that I can read it and it can touch me like that and make it so clear, like how that's what we need to do with each other is hold each other's hearts in a love way, but like you said, not too tight,
not too light, not too tight. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so before we get more into your book, we're gonna do the signature questions that I have, which are a little bit fun, but tend towards more our beautifying of ourselves. What's your favorite lipstick or beauty tip that you would like to share with us?
Okay, sure. You sent me those questions and I thought, I don't really wear lipstick. So I honestly, if I'm being really honest, I have like the same lipstick that I've had for, I don't know, something like 20 years in my purse. So if I'm going to somewhere really fancy, I might put a little bit of that old on, but otherwise I just don't wear it. But I do think that my one tip is just my eyebrows. I have really light colored eyebrows, and so I have to put just a little bit of color on them every day. And that for me makes it look like I'm wearing makeup, or just kind of like bring some color to my face. Otherwise, I look a little bit washed out. So that's my one beauty tip that I have, and maybe that everyone else knows that. But for me, my eyebrows are just too light for my face most of the time.
And they look beautiful, and you look
Thank you.
beautiful. And I think that's a little bit part of it. I always think that God gives us a feature to enhance
Yeah.
and to celebrate beauty in a sense. So yours would be your eyebrow. And I think my sister's got the greatest eyebrows. I would say for me, it would probably be my skin, or at least that's what people tell me. And so some people it's their hair, some people it's their nose. I do love that tip. And so as we're talking about the beauty, and we're kind of more focusing on how our appearance and how we look at this point, but I think how we feel about ourselves as God's daughter obviously affects how we deal with that too. And as your book does talk about well-being and all that, have you personally ever struggled with your beauty or how you see yourself in that sense?
Yeah. I think we all have, we all do, right? I continue to have that struggle sometimes, even as I'm trying so hard to heal from that struggle, right? One of the more vulnerable chapters of my book focuses on body image and weight. And I think that is probably the beauty struggle that I come back to a lot because we've been taught by the world that beautiful sort of corresponds to thin, right? And, or at least that's the message that I've always had in the back of my mind. And so that is the struggle that I have to come back to time and time again. And I think I'm healing from that and sort of learning to appreciate my body and the way it was designed and the curves that I naturally have rather than try to exercise them away or, restrict them away with my food. And so that story in the book is really probably the most personal to me. And I think one that probably resonates with many, many women that our beauty really has little to do with our weight or sort of the ideals that are held up to us and how beautiful we can be when we come to love and appreciate these bodies that we actually have.
Yes, when I read in there, you said the average weight and height for women is 5'4" and 170 pounds. Now, why that registers me, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so average. And so, not that that doesn't make me want to, be in the best health that I can. And especially, because we want to keep our bodies nice and strong and
Sure.
not in a sense more so that we can enjoy the lives that we have and we can do what God has called us to do. If we're only on the inside and we don't focus our outside, then our outside body can suffer. If we only focus on our outside, then our inside can suffer. And so it's about finding that inner outer beauty connection that can help us
Yeah.
balance it. And but it did give me some perspective.
Yeah.
Instead of, in more sense, like you said, love yourself every day. And if you end up eating too much pie, start again the next day.
Yeah. It's not all lost, right? You can start again.
And there's nothing really wrong with that. Like, and so I'm learning to love my body, my curves too. And it really does make a difference.
Yeah, I have thought that, maybe 20 years ago when I was in college or my young 20s, I was probably the thinnest I have ever been. But when I look at the way I was nourishing my body and the way I was treating my body and the way I was speaking to my body and my mental health around that, that was probably the unhealthiest I've ever been. And so now I am heavier than that, for sure. I have gained weight sort of through my intuitive eating approach, and I can say that I'm nourishing my body in a such a wonderful and beautiful way, and I think just my mental health is so much better. So that weight and that external appearance of our bodies is only part of the puzzle, and we also have to look at our mental and emotional health and how we're speaking and caring for our bodies in the meantime. So I would say I'm in a much healthier place now. And if we used the scale as that measure, it would not be an accurate measure.
Lysa Terrest, the
Okay.
writer,
Hmm.
and one of her book, she wrote that it was the thing about having the thing with the scale, and she's even you know how you have a ponytail tire in your hair, like you
Oh,
would
yeah.
take that off, like oh that'll make me.
Sure. That one out. Get rid of all of that. Yeah, I can
Yeah.
relate.
Part of it is the culture we live in, the world we live in. It starts when we're very young. I know I had an eating disorder when I was in high school. I had bulimia for a few years, and a lot of those disorders, though, aren't just coming from. And I think this is what really I liked about your book is they're not just coming from maybe the world messaging and all that, because some of it's so interconnected, you know. So
Mhm.
some of that healing was more, I mean, some of that being, I guess, insecure about how you look or are because of maybe trauma that happens to you earlier
Yeah.
makes you more susceptible to that kind of messaging.
I think that a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times, eating disorders kind of come about with this idea of control. Like when the world is out of control, especially for those who are experiencing trauma or something that's happening outside of their bodies or to their bodies that they can't control, sometimes an eating disorder can rear its head because you can control what you put into your body, or you can control, what purging and deciding to purge something from your body, as in bulimia in your case. And so I think that eating disorders and trauma and that idea of control are really interconnected.
Mm. And so if we don't heal early and we carry that trauma through like into our middle lives, into our latter lives, I mean, it's just too much weight for anybody to. When I know about body weight, we're talking about spiritual, emotional, just everything. And so let's talk about that. Like how can say the woman has entered her middle years and she's still hanging on to some of that.
Yeah. Well, I think the really hard thing about trauma is we have to begin by naming it. And that has been my experience. I really didn't talk about my own trauma growing up and sexual abuse until I was well into my 30s. It was just something that I tucked away like, it's fine. I'm fine. It's not that big a deal. I'm going to just like carry on. And I was really good at striving and getting all these accomplishments. And now, from a distance looking back, I'm like, I think I spent a lot of time covering up these wounds that I was carrying and just kind of hoping that if I pushed hard enough, I wouldn't really ever have to look at them. And so my own healing has really begun just by pulling the trauma out into the light and saying, hey, this happened to me. And this was really something I've carried forever. And it was hard. And it still hurts me sometimes. And it still can be just right there. And so I don't think I really understood the idea of healing until I was able to talk about that in a way that wasn't filled with shame or guilt or fear or it was my fault or any of those things. And so that can be so hard for people to do. And I have listened to women talk about their lives and their hurts and their traumas. And I know that that feeling that I have is really universal when something like that, whatever it might be, it could be trauma in a different way, be physical abuse or emotional abuse or loss or, there's all kinds of things that can cause trauma for us. But I think not hiding those things, not tucking them away, not trying to just, you know, prove our way out of it with accomplishments and other things is that first step toward healing. And many of us, most of us, probably need a therapist or someone to work with as we work through those things. Someone that we can safely talk to about it, that we can bring it out in the light and know that there is no one on the other end that we're going to hurt or that could be hurt by that. So I do think in therapy with a trauma-informed specialist would be the place to start.
And then say with your own healing, and then we can talk about your story of the young lady Crystal, which I think this with your patients when they would come to you, and even though that wasn't particularly your area,
Yeah.
because everything's so interconnected, it becomes your area, because
Right.
probably a lot of their difficulties they're having are stemming from healing that needs to be done in some area, wherever it might be, as you say. And so, did that help you? And I think it did, is from reading your book, address your own healing. That maybe because I think perhaps it's all in layers. Perhaps
Mhm.
God knows when we're ready.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, well, a few things happened when I was out in clinical practice. When I was in residency, my husband was in and out of rehab. He is a recovering drug and alcohol addict. And so when I started going to visit him in rehab and then I started going to Al Anon, it was like the first time that I had really ever heard people telling the truth of their lives. I mean, up until that point, it was like, oh, you have this internal part of you that you don't share with anyone. And then what you share with people is your like external shiny life. Isn't that what we're all doing? And I went to Al Anon and I'm hearing these people tell these horrible stories or these really tragic things or these bad things that were happening in their lives. And I thought, oh, you can do that. You can just tell the truth and you can just pull these things into the light and tell other people about it. And there was no shame about it. Everyone would just nod and say, oh, yeah, and I thought, wow, that's really, it was so freeing. And so I started with that part of my story to say, what I'm currently experiencing is my marriage is crumbling and I don't know how to fix this person that I love. And I think he's probably going to die. And just saying those things aloud to people in the room. And then that sort of allowed me to open up a part of myself to say, what is even deeper than that? And that's where I kind of learned to start talking about my history of sexual abuse and things like that. And so when I started seeing patients and they would be going through something really hard, I do think just understanding that need to approach a human being without any form of shame and just this openness that you can really tell me anything and I'm here to help you walk that journey. I think it did really allow me to just have the space for other people. And so the feedback that I would ever get from anyone was like, I don't know why I'm telling you this, or I have never talked to someone, like this, or had a doctor like this who just listens and that I can tell things to. And so I know that that was because of my own life experience and my own time in Al Anon and just my own background with abuse kind of coming to the surface and saying, yeah, me too. I'm a hurt human as well. So let's be hurt together and kind of move toward healing.
Yeah, what gives you empathy and compassion.
Yeah.
And so, another story in your book, and there's so many wonderful stories in there, is the story of a young lady, Crystal. And so, tell us a little bit about that and how that impacted you.
Yeah. Crystal. So, first of all, I worked as what's called a PRN provider, which means at the end of my clinical practice, I was just filling in for people here and there. I would pick up 2 or 3 shifts a month so that I could be home with my little kiddos and do the stay-at-home mom thing as well and stay current. And so whenever I went to clinic, it was with people I hadn't met before. So these were never patients that I had a relationship with or that I knew. They were always new patients to me. So she was a new patient to me and was coming just to follow up her depression medication and just needed a refill. And I always read about my patients before I go in to see them, just the last few notes and what they're taking and what's going on. So I sort of knew her story, but through the course of us talking, there was something more there, I think. And so in the book, I describe this listening to her talking and her telling about her life. And she was working as like a kind of like a hospice care provider or someone who would relieve caregivers. She was in a respite program where the caregiver could go out for a little while and she would take over the care. And she was telling that story and her voice sort of trailed away. And she just said, oh, I'm fine. It's fine. I'm doing fine. And I just need a refill. And she just trailed away. And I just felt like there was something more. And so I just said nothing. And so I've learned that silence is so powerful. And I didn't turn to the computer and refill her meds. And I didn't say, okay, and conclude our appointment. I just sort of sat there for a minute. And it was enough to be a little uncomfortable, just kind of waiting. And then she said, Dr. Albertson, can I tell you something? And then she proceeded to tell the story of how a lot of times after work, she buys an entire case of beer and then she goes home, and she often would sit in front of the mirror in her room because there was a mirror in her closet door, and she would watch herself drink. And then once she drank enough to be feeling some effects, she would begin to yell at herself and how she hated herself. And then I just listened and I held her hand, and she said, and then sometimes she showed how she would use the tabs of the cans to cut her arms. And all this pain just came spilling out. And it was like this powerful, horrible, beautiful moment, right? That I had with someone else whose trauma was just spilling out all over the place. And she really needed a lot more help than she was getting. And so it was this first step into getting her in to see someone else and getting her in to see a therapist. And, I didn't get to see her again. That was the only encounter that I had with her. But I did just hug her and say, just stay. Because I think she was to the point where sometimes she was suicidal. She wasn't suicidal in my office, but she hated her life and she was just so desperate. And so I just hugged her and said, just stay. Like, we need you and the world needs you and all the people that you serve need you. And it was so beautiful and powerful. And I have thought about her so many times, and I pray for my patients a lot. And she was just someone who really left an impact on me. And I hope that I left an impact on her as well.
I'm sure you did, because she did say at the end, I will stay.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that's also part of it too, is like, as we get older and those of us who have, and most of us have experienced some type of trauma, then to go through the healing process so that we can be there for other people who are going through that process too. And that beautiful exchange that you can have, that one is, I see you, I've been there, I promise you, you can heal and life can be better.
Yeah.
And it's just to let people know that that's possible, instead of, because I've had people who've taken their lives too. And I've always been like, if I could have just gotten them and told them that, like one person did it over, it's had to be more than that, but it was finances. I was like, finances, you can pay off your debt.
Yeah.
It's the over finances. No, obviously it was probably just,
All the layers. Yeah.
all the layers. I mean, backtracking, actually, in our 20s, the same person that I knew once wanted to jump off a ceiling, and I had talked him down. And so here we are going, many, many years later. I thought he was happily married, successful in New York, and I just thought he's gone off to have a great life. And then, never got that healing that he needed,
Yeah, and I think we think about healing as if we'll reach this point where we're just healed. We're all better. And I'm not there yet for sure. And I don't know, I've had the privilege of talking to so many people, and I don't know if we ever are. And so I like to point out that our healing is forever. It takes a lifetime. There's so many layers. And so some days we may be feeling, wow, I'm doing so awesome and look at me and my healing. And then there are things that can happen that pull us backwards a little bit. And so it is a lifelong journey, I think. And we can be in different stages of our healing really forever. And I don't mean to say that as like, what a downer that is, that we're never going to make it, but to just say like, take yourself off the hook. Like, it's okay that comes back to you sometimes, or it's okay that you're in these valleys sometimes. I think that is everyone. That's the human experience. I lost a family member last year in January, I think. Yeah. And what we had in common is that we have the same abusers. And so it was so close to me. It was so close to me, even though I wasn't really that close to this person. And so to say that it just set me back so far and also not because I could see our experiences so differently and just think like, I am in a different place now. I have found so much healing, but so sad and tragic to know that she hadn't. It just set me so far back. It was really something. But I think that's why our healing is this just forever lifelong process. There are so many interconnected things, right?
There is, and I know for me, it is a daily thing, turning over to Jesus every day, just
Yeah.
saying, because he knows.
Yeah.
He knows what you're going through, and he can help. Although, like we said, I agree, it's a lifetime thing, because until we pass, it's just part of the human experience. There will always be, even if it isn't past trauma, there will be little bumps in the road that come
Sure.
up, and it's just and sometimes it's what was done to us, sometimes it's what we do to ourselves, sometimes it's just
Mhm.
the environment. And it's just kind of what happens. But I think it's we anchor our faith, and then we are able to walk through it in a way that I know for me, before I came back to my faith, that I wasn't able to,
Yeah.
like trying to fix it myself. And it was
Yeah.
the one day to realize that I can't fix this, and I'm not supposed to. I'm just supposed to do the best I can do, and then turn it over to, God, who can fix it,
Yeah.
or give me the strength and understanding. And I think part of that, I know that's part of rehabilitation, at least like with my father when he quit drinking, as part of it was to go and help others
Mhm.
with their struggle. And so I think that's part of it too. The more we help other people with what we're our own personal struggles, that gives us also the strength to keep going forward.
Yeah, you're right. I feel that so much.
So I'm so happy that, so for our listeners, on your story, that your husband did come through.
Yeah, he and I were married in our young 20s, very young, and his using drugs and alcohol really started during medical school, I think, as a coping strategy. And that was a long struggle for us, a many years struggle for us. We had two children while he was still using, and we were both in residency. And I I don't know why we get to be the lucky ones. I really don't. He will describe it as just the most spiritual experience he's ever had and how he got better through those couple stays in rehab. But he is 15 plus years clean and sober now. And I do think that it has made him much different in his life as well. And I think you're exactly right about the idea of service and how the way to sort of continue your own healing and your own sober journey is to be of service to others. And he is like the most service oriented person I know, just in work and with people and coaching. And he's very generous with what he has to give. And so I it's interesting. I remember knowing like that person is in there somewhere. And I'm so grateful that he gets to spend his life being that person rather than waiting for a long time to find it. And so I do feel just lucky. And I've had so many women because I've shared this story in my books, and I will hear messaging sometimes like, that isn't how it went for me. And I, I'm so sorry. It is so hard. And I do know that as we began healing from that, it became a very separate journey. And I do think that that was the beginning of any healing that we found, is when I decided that I wasn't going to fix him and he probably was going to die. And there was absolutely nothing I could do, but I could sort of save myself. And that was the real turning point for me. And so we are together, and we do live kind of a separate healing journey even still. And so I don't know if that mindset is helpful for anyone. I hope that it is, but I know that our experience isn't the norm. It isn't, what typically happens, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that is such valuable advice, though, right there. Is like to not try to fix somebody, and to realize severity of the situation,
Mhm.
not just to to gloss it over. I think you had quoted the Serenity prayer.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to quote that now, I don't think that.
Yeah, I just think the Serenity prayer applies to almost every aspect of life. I can't imagine anything that it doesn't apply to. Motherhood, relationships, work, your health, all these things. And the Serenity prayer is, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I think it's that last line, the wisdom to know the difference, that can be the tricky one that tricks us all up. And that one to me is where I rely a lot on God and prayer. And I'm always messing that up, right? I'm always trying to grab onto things that I actually don't have a lot of control over. And that is the lesson that God has been teaching me over and over and over again. Like, Mikala, you're doing that thing again. Remember, like, you're not in control, whatever it is, my teenagers or, the writing things or work things. It's like, there are so many things that I wish I could control that I cannot. But what I can focus on is myself and my own healing and my own words and my actions and reactions and how I spend my time and that kind of thing. So I come back to that again and again and again in so many ways.
And so again, that's why that's so valuable for anybody who is suffering or going through a situation. And even if it's not a spouse, it could be a family member, it could be somebody at work, and it doesn't necessarily even have to be, it could be any kind of thing that is taking them away from themselves, when
Yeah.
they're getting lost in it. It could be drinking, it could be alcohol, it could be gambling, it could be
Mm.
sexual addiction, there's so many different things that it can be. And, in my own marriage, we've struggled through things through life. We're, 32 years in, and
Mm-hmm.
it's, when you start off with them in your 20s and you're basically kids, and you do have to learn
Yeah.
that point at some point that you have to let each other have their individual journey, and then along the way certain things will come up that will help me release that, which is, one was that movie War Room, where she started
Mm.
praying for her husband instead of trying to change him.
Yeah.
And I know there's an author out right now who I know, Amanda, a book called Pray for Him.
Mm.
And it's about the same thing, pray for, we can't change those in our life that we love, but we can pray for them. And how powerful that is, because in a sense it changes our behavior.
Yeah. There's a phrase in the recovery movement that was so helpful to me, which was bless them, change me. I don't know if you've ever heard that before, but bless them, change me. And so to just pray blessings on that person and then work on changing your own behavior. God bless them, change me, has been so powerful for me.
Yeah, because if we can do that, then we can, I want to say this young lady's name correctly, Amanda Hayhurst, her book, Pray for Her.
Oh, okay.
And if that, I love what you said about the separate healing journey too, because God needs to work on our individual hearts. I mean, we can be connected as husband and wife, but at the same time, we have to realize that those journeys need to be separate. I know when my husband and I were prodigals, just by, God's providential hand, we were placed in different countries through a job.
Oh, mm-hmm.
And through just that experience, which was so like stressful in our marriage, and probably if this wouldn't have happened, probably would have ended in, I think, divorce.
Mm.
But we had enough space away from each other, enough anger at each other, enough that it made my husband start reading the Bible. Now, had we been together in the same space, that may not have happened.
Yeah.
And then we were Skyping, and he announced to me he was reading it. And that sent me the message, I want to read it.
Yeah.
And that night when I read it was when I had my comeback Holy Spirit moment. And I really do believe God devised it that way, because he needed to reach us each individually.
Yeah.
To bring us back together. I know.
I love that.
Yeah. So I hope that helps our listeners out there. Anybody who's going through anything like that. Let's talk about some practical things now for midlife women. And so your book is, I guess, in your words, a manual for the
Yeah.
midlife, and you talk about preventative health. And so, what are some tips that you can give us, like for preventative health, maybe as we start entering perimenopause?
Yeah, I probably will say things that are annoying to a lot of people because what we often have to come back to in midlife, especially as our hormones begin to change and maybe we're having some perimenopausal symptoms, is those basics that we already know that we've been hearing for a long time. So I know that sometimes it's frustrating. Like if you tell me to eat right and exercise, like I don't want to hear it, but it's true. They really do help so, so much. So I have a page in the book in the chapter on what to expect in perimenopause, kind of at the end, that is titled Let's Review Where You Can Start. And I think that it's important to perimenopausal symptoms, but it's important for all women in all stages, just for general health. And so that first one starts with how we nourish our bodies. What are we feeding ourselves? Could we improve that by just adding a fruit or vegetable to every meal? Really focusing in on lean protein and trying to maybe eliminate ultra processed foods or at least reduce our ultra processed foods. We know that it's hard to put into practice sometimes, but it makes a huge difference in how you feel during this time. The second one is about moving our bodies. How are we moving our bodies? Not necessarily for burning calories or for weight loss, but just for general health, for how we feel, for our bone health and our muscle health and our joint health and our mental health. And so the medical community will recommend about 150 minutes of moderate exercise per week, which actually isn't like a terrible number when you divide it out. And you can divide it any way you want. So if you want to do longer workouts 3 days a week, go for it. If you want to do shorter workouts 6 days a week, that also counts. It's kind of cumulative over the week. So I do like to encourage women, at least in their 40s and beyond, to get some form of resistance training. So if you use bands or dumbbells or yoga or something just to maintain that muscle mass, which we start losing once we go through menopause and our hormone levels are declining. So the third thing on there is really working on stress. I have a whole chapter on stress in this book. We are never going to avoid feeling stress. And so this chapter focuses on how do we manage the stress that we are inevitably going to have? How do we move through the stress cycle? And it's got some great tips in there about how to do that every day. The fourth thing is to avoid smoking and really limit your alcohol use. This is a big one, and I hear from women all the time. I actually can't drink anymore. I feel terrible when I drink wine. I have a headache every time, and my body just doesn't do it anymore. That is pretty common, and I do think if we could, you don't have to eliminate it completely, but really reduce alcohol use, we'll feel better in the long run. And then just finding support is the final one. Finding support from your teams, whether that's your friends or your neighbors or close family members. Social connection is so important. It is as important as nutrition and exercise and rest and sleep and all of those things. So, and then finally, I have a whole chapter on preventive care. And I think it's really important to be seeing your doctor regularly and just stay up to date on those things that are recommended for health promotion and also illness prevention. So your mammogram, your colonoscopy, your pap smears or vaccinations, things like that. It's important in your 40s and beyond to start going once a year to your doctor at least to stay on top of those exams.
You were talking about how you finish the cycle.
Oh, yeah.
That for me, I think when we're talking about, because preventative health isn't something that you could practice your whole life.
Yeah.
We just don't start in our 20s and then end in our 40s, or start in our 40s and then end in our 60s.
Yeah.
It's a lifestyle, really.
Yeah,
And
agreed.
so that was one thing that I felt like, oh, that is helping me, I guess, regulate my day in a sense.
Yeah, agreed. I a lot of that information that I include in that stress chapter in completing the stress cycle comes from the book Burnout by the Nagoski sisters, and it's so good. I would highly recommend that book. It kind of is this chapter in whole book form. So they go a lot more into the background of stress and what's going on in the body and that kind of thing. So it's a wonderful book. I It's probably around 2019 or maybe 2020 when that came out, but I think it still holds true. They kind of go through this idea of completing the stress cycle. So we are inevitably going to feel stressed by something at work or something that happened with someone in the family or whatever it is, and our body reacts. And so we have these hormones and neurotransmitters that react to stress, cortisol and norepinephrine and epinephrine and those things. And they sort of spike in response because our body is created to do fight or flight. And then I do talk in there about the idea of freeze, which often comes with like deeper traumas. And our blood pressure raises, and we sort of divert blood away from the less important things at the time, like digestion and things like that, and sort of funnel it to the heart and our muscles and that kind of thing in preparation for either fighting something off or running away, right? And so if we're constantly getting revved up from stress and we don't somehow complete that cycle, we can end up with high blood pressure or poor sleep or these kind of medical conditions that can come along with it. And so they really highlight how we can complete that cycle, either through exercise or emotional expression, like crying is actually really healthy when you're upset and you just want to like cry it out in the car on the way home. That's actually you completing that cycle and sort of taking care of all of those hormones and neurotransmitters that are revved up. They can kind of then go back to that rest and digest feeling. So, emotional expression, creative expression, social connection. So, getting together with a girlfriend who will hug you and listen to you vent and talk out your day. Like, you just have to do something to address that stress or address that whatever incident it was. And they just talk about, I think exercise is the big one for me, just going for a walk where I really pump my arms and I'm just like, "Ugh," that really helps me bring everything back down. And then you can return to that rest and digest state, and those hormones and neurotransmitters will go back to their sort of resting balance, and you can be ready to face the next stress the next day. So I do like the idea that, hey, that's probably an everyday practice that you need to have because we come up against stress in some form or another every day.
I mean, it is fascinating to think about that, like our body and just all the reactions, the hormones, everything going through it, and then how to properly, I guess, balance and manage it so
Yeah.
that, and how just that can create havoc and disease. And if
Mhm.
it, and that's why they say stress can kill you because
For
if you don't
sure.
manage it properly.
Yeah, I think the mental switch for me too is to say, I think we try to like manage stress before it happens. Like, I'm just going to arrange everything in my life and in my relationship so I never have to feel stressed. And like the mental shift for me is like, oh, you're going to feel stressed. But what are you going to do about that? Like, how are you going to manage? I think that's really important to just like, stress is inevitable. Everybody comes up against it. It isn't that you're doing something wrong or you weren't managing something appropriately. Now you have the control over how you're going to like come through it and what you're going to do about it.
Through the story of Betty and through where that leads to the heartbeat of your book, let's talk about that.
Yeah. So I just always remember what a privilege it is, I think, to get to practice medicine and to have been so close to other people's stories. It has been just an absolute gift to me to have been able to hear someone else's story and really hold it close. And Betty is a patient that I got to be very close to at the end of life. She's someone I had taken care of for years. And then she had to have a hip replacement and she had a bad outcome from that. And so she was actually quite healthy going in. So it was a bit of a surprise and just really disappointing. And I really felt like for a little bit that I had done something wrong. Like I had missed something in her pre-op exam. Was there something I overlooked, or in her initial care coming out of surgery, is there something that I had done wrong with her fluids or something like that? And the truth of the matter was that she had had a heart attack while she was in surgery, and that can happen. She was in her 80s, and her heart just really couldn't recover from that. And so she went into heart failure. And so that was just a sad thing to experience and to watch. But at the end of her life, she was in the ICU then, out of surgery, and I went to visit her. I wasn't really managing her care once she was in the ICU. Kind of the ICU doctors kind of take over those more critical care patients, but I still would go and see her every day and just try to keep up on what was going on and be there for her. And there was this moment when no one was there. I had to round always very early in the morning before clinic. So it was probably 5:30 or something in the morning. And so her family hadn't come yet for the day, and it was just very quiet. And I got to just sit with her for a minute. And I have learned over the years that a lot of times when people have a moment of clarity, that often then corresponds with their last day. So sometimes it means they're getting better, but in her case, it was her last day, and she did have this bit of clarity. And I just describe in the book coming in to see her, sort of looking out the window. And when I sat on the side of her bed, she recognized me, which hadn't been happening for a few days. And I just held her hand and just said, "Betty, how are you doing this morning?" And she looked at me and she just said, "Thank you for taking care of me." And she called me sweetheart. And then she told me that she loved me. And it was this beautiful, beautiful moment that happened 16 years ago. And I remember going home, and I walked with my neighbor that evening, and I said, "This woman said she loved me today before she died." And it made me cry. It was this beautiful, beautiful moment. And I remember just thinking, I am so unsure about my life and what I'm supposed to be doing. And I think we get caught up on meaning and what is the purpose of my life and what am I supposed to be doing with my life? I get caught up on it now. Like, should I be doing something more? Like, what am I doing here? What's the meaning? And just sitting with her there that day and her holding my hand and saying, "Thank you for taking care of me, sweetheart," and saying, "I love you." It reduced me to this. It's about love. The whole thing is about love. Why the meaning and purpose of our lives is about love. And we may not figure anything else out as we go, but we are loved and we have loved. And that is the whole point. And so I hope that my readers, with that story and with all of it, actually just come away knowing that they are beautiful and that they were created with purpose, and that they are just so incredibly loved.
That's so beautiful, and I'm teary. I picked up one of the most beautiful messages that I think that if we all know that and feel that and accept that, name that, that's the healing right there, and that's just the joy. That's the joy of life right there.
Yeah. I always think, what would life be like for all of us if we could actually believe how loved we are? I think it would change so much. It would change how we move through our day. It would change how we take care of our bodies. It would change our interactions with others. So to really believe we are loved.
Yeah, then if we really believe we're loved, then we won't be worrying about, are we doing enough? Are we?
Yeah, none of it.
Because we'll be secure. We'll be. I
Right.
mean, the thing I think for me at least, the one that am I doing enough? What's my a lot of that is me just being insecure about being loved,
Sure.
and just trusting that no, I have this good Father, God, who's taking very good care of me, and I just need
Yes.
to be loved by Him. So that's a gorgeous, beautiful message for people, and for our listeners to hear today. You are definitely loved, and I know you've gone through some really difficult things in life, but one, God's able to use that to bring you to this to see life this way,
Yeah.
in the sense that helps me understand maybe why we go through hard things in life.
Right. And that's not to say, I think it's hard. We offer those platitudes to one another. Everything happens for a reason, or, oh, God has a plan with this. And at the time, that feels a little dismissive, or, it can feel hurtful. But to believe, I don't know what's going to happen through this, but I do know that I'm loved. And to say to someone else, I don't know how you're going to come through this or what's going to happen next. And I'm so sorry that it is so hard. And you are loved. I think that changes how we approach things. We don't have to find the reason right away, or we don't have to say, oh, I'm going to do something with this story later.
Sometimes we want to put a little bandage on, or
Yeah.
want to hurry along the process, or we want to rather than to sit in that space if we don't know.
We don't know. And we are loved. And I think love can change our
that's
approach to those things. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Would you like to say, and well, first, is there anything upcoming that we should know about?
Well, I don't have any new books on the way as of yet. I would love to invite readers to stay in touch with me over on my website. It's MikalaAlbertsonMD.com. I've got monthly love notes that go out to my readers, and they include just a personal letter from me. And then I like to include a podcast episode and a recipe that's good and maybe a book recommendation, but it's just a way for us to keep in touch. So that's where I'm spending a lot of my energy right now, is on my website and in those monthly love notes. And I'm writing, and hopefully there will be more books to come.
Okay. Would you like to give a prayer?
Yeah, sure. I am not the best at praying out loud, but I don't think Jesus cares.
He does.
Dear God, thank you for this conversation today. Thank you for the connection that we had together and with our readers. And thank you for loving us always. May we move forward through our days knowing that you are with us and that we are not alone in this healing journey, and that no matter what comes our way, we are loved through it all. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. It was just wonderful to have you on here, and that was a beautiful prayer. And I'm so excited for our listeners to hear this.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hi, thank you for listening to Beholder Beauty Podcast. I'd love you to sign up, subscribe, follow, like, do all those things, because it really does help support this podcast. Be sure to pick up Dr. Mikala Albertson's new book and pick up Unexpected Blessings, 40 Days of Discovering God's Best, which is out now. And keep an eye out for my new poetry collection that's coming out later this year. So please subscribe so that you don't miss an episode. Have a lovely day.